Canada has long been pitched as the sophisticated, European-style cousin of the United States. A country just as wealthy, but without the inequality, violence, or political polarization that often plagues its southern neighbor. Oh, and let's not forget universal healthcare for all. It was almost like a Nordic country, but made in North America, and not just because of the cold. But here's the thing, folks, that image was never entirely true. Canada has always been noticeably poorer than the United States. Still, its economy was doing well enough to make those comparisons without blushing. That is, until now. Things have taken a dramatic turn for the worse. The average Canadian standard of living plummeted between 2020 and 2024, with per capita GDP dropping by 2%, the worst 5-year decline since the Great Depression. Canada is facing its worst crisis in a century. To put this in perspective, Canada is poorer today than it was 6 years ago. Its economy is as stagnant as Germany's, while its southern neighbor, the US, has grown by 10% since the third quarter of 2019. Or let's look at it another way, a wealthy country like Canada typically grows at 2 to 3% per year. Well, the land of maple syrup hasn't just failed to grow, it's been shrinking by 0.4% annually since before the pandemic. But hold on, because that's not even the wildest statistic. There's been a mass exodus of people fleeing Canada for the US in 2023 alone. 125,000 Canadians crossed the border to settle in the States, 10 times more than the number moving in the opposite direction. Keep in mind, Canada's population is 40 million, while the US is 340 million. So, sorry to burst the bubble, but Canada's air of superiority doesn't hold up anymore. Now, you're probably wondering, is this all the government's fault? Or, I don't know, maybe it's somehow Donald Trump's doing? Why did this crisis explode right after the pandemic? And most importantly, what's the government planning to do about it? Well, stick around, because in this video, we're going to answer all those questions. The worst 5 years since the Great Depression. That's right, 5 years of economic disaster. It's a catastrophe, especially for a country like Canada. Historically, Canada has been the poster child for stability. Even during the Great Depression, things weren't as bad for Canadians as you might think. Back in the late 1920s, only a couple of Canadian banks failed, accounting for just 0.6% of the country's deposits. Compare that to the US, which lost nearly 5 times as much in relative terms, despite being a much larger economy. And check this out, between 1934 and 2009, only one Canadian bank failed, in 1987. Even during the 2008 global financial crisis, not a single Canadian bank went under. Zero. While banks were collapsing like dominoes worldwide, Canada stood strong. So why bring this up? Because it shows just how abnormal the current situation is. The country that was practically immune to crises has been economically stagnant for over 7 years now. And no, it's not just because of COVID, most countries have recovered, but Canada hasn't. So, what's going on? Let's look at some of the usual suspects. First up, former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Economic growth was never his top priority, especially when it came to energy policy. Take the Northern Gateway Pipeline, for example, a $8 billion project critical for exporting Canadian gas to Asia. Trudeau scrapped it, just like that. A potential gold mine for export revenue? Gone. And then there's another pipeline that did get built under his watch. Sounds good, right? Well, its cost ballooned to $34 billion, 6 times the original budget. Why? Endless environmental reviews, mid-project changes, and international investors who bolted. The new government, from the same party, realized this was nonsense and introduced fast-track approvals for infrastructure projects. Problem is, it's too little, too late, and Canada's energy sector is still bogged down by red tape. But that's not all. Ever heard of Canada's supply management system? A White House official once said, Canada has repeatedly shown a lack of seriousness in trade negotiations when it comes to removing trade barriers. They were talking about Canada's agricultural marketing boards, which one trade lawyer called a Soviet-style supply management system. In Canada, a small group of people holds massive power to decide which agricultural products get in and which don't. These boards set prices, control quantities, and even impose production quotas. The result? Basic goods like milk cost twice as much in Canada as in the US, even though Canadian household disposable income is a third lower than in the States, adjusted for prices. No wonder the cost of living is the top concern for Canadian voters in every poll. This system costs each Canadian household between $300 and $430 a year. But wait, it gets worse. Canada also has internal tariffs, yes, trade barriers between its own provinces, mostly in the form of regulations. This isn't some progressive policy, it's straight out of the Middle Ages. These internal barriers drain 3 to 4% of Canada's GDP, a massive economic hit. Still, these issues don't fully explain the current crisis. They're serious, long-standing problems that have held Canada back, but they don't account for the brutal stagnation of recent years. To understand that, we need to dig into more recent data. According to the OECD, Canada's per capita GDP has been dragged down by 3 key factors: a shrinking workforce participation rate, rising unemployment, and, most critically, a sharp drop in capital per worker. The OECD expected this metric to grow by 3.7%, but it fell by 1.4%. While labor productivity has inched up slightly, Canada's economy is clearly failing to harness its workers' full potential. Why? 2 major issues: insufficient capital and workforce challenges. For workers to be productive, they need capital, machines, equipment, software. That requires investment, and Canada's been flunking this for years. It's the second lowest G7 country in R&D investment, just above Italy. And it's not making up for it with foreign investment either. In the early 2000s, Canada attracted foreign investment worth 9% of its GDP. Now, it's stuck at 2 to 3%. Post-2008 crisis regulations made it harder for foreign investment to flow in, and Canada's economy relies heavily on imports. 50% of its machinery comes from abroad. Mostly the US global trade disruptions haven't helped, and Canada's been hit especially hard. Then there's the workforce. Youth unemployment is at a 15-year high of 14%, double the national average. Part of this is due to trade barriers, like Donald Trump's tariffs, which hit industries where young people often work. But many point to mass immigration as a bigger factor. Under Trudeau, Canada opened its doors wide. In just 4 years, the non-permanent resident population tripled from 1 million to 3 million. This influx, mostly male and often low-skilled, has skewed demographics. There are now 10% more men than women. The new government is reversing course, tightening immigration policies. A Bank of Canada study suggests that without this immigration, wages would be 0.7% higher. But this doesn't mean native-born Canadians are earning less, it's just that lower-paid immigrants bring down the average. Think of it like adding average height people to an NBA team. The team's average height drops, but the original players are still just as tall. Immigration isn't inherently bad. In a dynamic economy, even low-skilled immigrants boost demand for housing, food, and services. Studies in the US show that mass immigration doesn't harm local workers' jobs or wages. But Canada's economy isn't as dynamic as the US's. The biggest choke point? Housing. Canada's population has surged, but housing construction hasn't kept up. Home prices have doubled in a decade, strangling young people who can't afford to move to productive urban centers. This isn't just a social issue, it's an economic anchor. Housing prices are finally starting to dip, but the damage is done, and recovery will take years. Then there's household debt, which has skyrocketed since 2010. Canadian families are borrowing at levels higher than Japan's during its housing bubble. And let's not forget government spending. Trudeau's administration ran 9 consecutive budget deficits, doubling the national debt. The new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, promised tax cuts to stimulate the economy, but without slashing spending, it's like trying to lose weight by eating sugar-free donuts. It doesn't work. Carney's plan could push the deficit to $70 to $90 billion, the second highest in Canada's history, only behind COVID-era spending. Despite low inflation giving the Bank of Canada room to cut interest rates, the economy remains stuck. So, what's the root of all this? Canada got complacent. After dodging the 2008 crisis, it acted like the golden child of the global economy. Why reform when you're the model? But good times don't last forever. Enter the final blow, Donald Trump's trade war. Canada's GDP contracted by 1.6% annualized in 2025, worse than the expected 0.6%. Trump's tariffs, higher than those on China, hit hard. Canada exports 95% of its oil and gas to the US and imports half its machinery from there. Exports dropped 7.5% in a single quarter. Canada's Canada First retaliation, boycotting US goods, backfired, hurting its own economy. Carney's pushing to diversify trade, but entrenched interest groups like environmentalists and agricultural boards slow progress. In short, Trump's tariffs were the gust that toppled Canada's house of cards. But the real problem was the shaky foundation, decades of internal barriers, underinvestment, and now reckless spending. Canada's in a tough spot, and recovery won't be quick. So, what do you think? Were you aware of Canada's economic nosedive? Is this a temporary blip, or are the structural issues deeper than they seem? Can Canada pull itself out of this lost decade? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe for more weekly content, and we'll see you in the next one. Take care.